LWVUS. And thank you, Kathy. And we're here with the CHARGE Hub today. For those of you who don't know, we're the coalition hub for advancing redistricting and grassroots engagement. And for the past year and a half or so, our work has primarily focused on centralizing training and advocacy for folks on the ground across the nation surrounding redistricting and civic engagement and education around that. So our panel today is focused on Alabama, and we have a distinguished panel with us today. Just to set a few community norms, please mute yourself upon entry and feel free to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, organization, state, and pronouns. And throughout the discussion, if you have any questions, please drop them there and we will get to them at the Q&A at the end. And I would like to now introduce our moderator, Pat King. Pat is a member of LWV Alabama, and she's also been involved with the Huntsville chapter of the Southern Coalition, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. She is a retired educator and administrator and has been working on redistricting with the League of Women Voters in Alabama this past cycle. And with that, Pat, I will hand it over to you.
Good afternoon and welcome to the panel today. My name is Pat King and I'm with the League of Women Voters Alabama. Our discussion today centers on redistricting process in Alabama and the potential implications our ongoing litigation may have on the Voting Rights Act. We'll also hear about communities that have organized around redistricting and the importance of civic engagement during the entire process. We have a great panel of speakers, and let's start with Anneshia Hardy. Anneshia is the Executive Director for the C3 Alabama Values, C4 Alabama Values Progress, Civic and Advocacy Communication Hubs, providing messaging, research, and digital strategies for Alabama's pro-democracy movement. Anneshia is a scholar, activist, social venturist, and brand strategist with a passion for communications, research, community engagement, and tackling social issues. So glad to have you on, Anneshia.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Next, we have Khadidah Stone, and she is Data and Training Manager with Alabama Forward, the state CQ table. She also serves as Southern Coalition for Social Justice crowd fellow, providing community mapping and public testimony training to the communities in Central Alabama. Welcome, Khadidah.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Next, we have Tish Faulks, and she is the legal director of ACLU of Alabama. From standing up for the rights of transgender young people to defending the people's right to protest, Tish brings over 20 years of experience in litigating matters presenting complex questions of policy, substantive, and procedural law impacting equal rights, civil liberties, and social and racial justice. The ACLU and the ACLU of Alabama, NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, Alabama State Conference of the NAACP, and Greater Birmingham Ministries have led efforts to challenge the Alabama.
Pat, we lost you to mute there. Thank you for having me, everyone. There we go.
All right, Anneshia, redistricting is
Pat, we lost you to mute again.
Relations
in Alabama to draw new district maps from the federal level to the local level, which makes an impact on how funding is distributed for healthcare, schools, and roads, as well as ensuring our political representation is reflective of Alabama growing diverse communities. As a state-based communication hub, your organization, Alabama Values, play a key role in amplifying the work of grassroots and civic organizations on the ground, advocating for fair maps, along with providing content and messaging to raise awareness and increase mobilization around the fight. Can you tell us what was happening on the ground? What were some of the challenges and approaches?
Yes. Yeah. So, thank you for that question. Yeah. So, since launching in last year in 2021, we have worked closely with grassroots and civic organizations and individuals, working to increase civic engagement in Alabama, and organizations, advocating for fair maps and adequate representation in our state. You're right. Our role as a strategic communications partner and messaging and content developer, it ultimately positioned us to work and be a part of the work being done in Alabama around redistricting in a very hyper-local way. So, there were, grassroots orgs and coalitions such as Alabama Forward, our state civic table, Alabama Election Protection Network, the Ordinary People Society, the League of Women Voters Alabama. There were also, regional partners such as the Southern Coalition for Social Justice that had put in the work to become trusted messengers within targeted communities during this, this redistricting cycle, providing, that ongoing engagement and mobilization around redistricting through, public education programs, community mapping trainings, even providing testimony preparation ahead of the public hearings. But going into this cycle, there was a sense that this would be a very unique and challenging redistricting cycle. This was Alabama's first redistricting cycle in several decades, where the state was not required to submit maps to obtain preclearance from the Justice Department, which was typically done in the past to ensure that maps did not discriminate or dilute political power based on race, color, or membership in a protected language minority group. And historically, Alabama has a documented history of racial discrimination being embedded in all of our social structures, but particularly with its civic participatory activities, such as voting. There is a growing pro-democracy movement, and Alabamians are becoming more diverse, not just in party affiliation, but in social, political, and cultural ideology. Based on the census data, our state has grown a little bit over 6% since 2010, and we are now more than 5 million people, and that's counting, partly because of, international migration has, helped increase our population, as well as people moving back, to the state, and also people moving to the state for the first time. The census data also show that Alabama's, white population is shrinking while people of color are growing. So, with that context in mind, organizations began to rally around fair maps. Right, maps with lines drawn in a way that would provide voters with the ability to, to join together to create majority minority districts that would allow non-white residents to get adequate representation and elect the candidates of their choice. But it became very evident during the public hearings that this process wasn't going in the right direction. Collectively, my team and I, we attended 26 of the 28 public hearings. And while attending those hearings, I got the opportunity to experience the pushback from legislators and see the public experience pushbacks from legislators when challenged, about the redistricting process. Community members presented concerns with keeping communities whole. Many of the comments at the hearing, questioned the committee's rationale for the hearing schedule and lack of transparency. And just to add a little context, this redistricting cycle, they only had one public hearing that was held after working hours, whereas in 2011, the redistricting cycle, in the 2011 redistricting cycle, there were 10 public hearings that were after working hours. But in true organizing fashion, we must adapt and strategize, right? So we began to record, we recorded all the public hearings and the legislative sessions and provided recaps for the media and for partner organizations that were on the ground. This proved to be very valuable, this strategy. It not only increased accessibility and transparency, but also, increased our ability to hold, officials accountable during and after the process. Community members asked many questions challenging the process. Often, we saw, there were questions regarding clarifications, regarding, the partisan nature of the process, and they were met with responses such as this is out of the scope of the hearing, or take it up with the state's, constitution. We have clips, during the legislative session where legislators walked into meetings and were asked to vote on maps and data that they were just seeing for the first time. Clips where it was confirmed that the Reapportionment Committee had not conducted a comprehensive study, of racial polarization prior to creating the congressional maps and state, maps. Also, there were several lawmakers from the minority party that mentioned that this would place our state in a very, vulnerable position with regards to, the liability of failing to comply with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And, we see how that is playing out, right now, months later, and 3, lawsuits. And then, also, during this process, we saw, in the battles in the State House and outside of the State House. In the State House, we saw the minority party pleading, to just, and plainly put, do the right thing, making the case that redistricting shouldn't be a partisan issue. It shouldn't be about maintaining power. Emotions, ran very high, in our state throughout this process. I can recall the last public hearing, ending abruptly. And I do mean abruptly. It lasted, less than 4 minutes. There was a total disregard, for, comments that were and questions that were being made during that hearing. And I can recall, the people and, organizers just kind of sat in that moment and just hearing the community and organizers encourage each other to just stay in the fight, that the fight isn't over. And the fight isn't over. You have organizations in our state that are continuing to fight, the fight is now going to the courts, and we're still continuing to fight on the ground by anchoring the work that was done in our state around redistricting as a movement builder, around other pro-democracy issues, and for the larger fight for voting rights, while the fight does continue in the courts.
All right, Tish, are you there?
I am, but I think you want to talk to Khadidah about her experience testifying before the state legislature and really being a part of moving the community service aspect of this for the people on the ground. Khadidah, I remember watching your testimony as it was being recorded by Annesia's organization. How did you end up doing that testimony, and what was the work you were working on?
So I was a crowd fellow with SCSJ, and the organization that hosted me was Alabama Forward. And so I was assigned to 12 different counties within the Black Belt region of Alabama. Those counties include Bullitt County, Choctaw, Dallas, Greene, Hale, Mounds, Macon, Marengo, Pickens, Perry, Sumter, and Montgomery in the state's capital. And so a lot of what that work looked like was educating communities in these counties about redistricting that was going on, not just in the state, but even if it was going on in their cities as well. And so during the time that public hearings came around, alongside the other fellows, I held town hall meetings after the public hearings to kind of recap and discuss what happened, because one of the weird things that these public hearings had was the time. The time was during the workday, And we all know that we are all working hard people and no one is going to a meeting during the workday. And so it wasn't fair to for a process to that involve the public, for it to be at an inconvenient time to where the public wasn't able to be there. And so we kind of saw the need. We were like, let's recap, after the workday is over, after 5 o'clock, and kind of just discuss what had happened during these public hearings, as well as giving out testimonial tutorials. There were a lot of people who wanted to give testimonies just as I did, but they weren't sure exactly how. And a main point that I made sure to emphasize throughout these testimony tutorials was to just tell your story. A huge part of this redistricting process is telling the story of the community that you come from, so that you are fairly represented, which is what it's all about. So alongside the public hearing recaps, the testimonies tutorials, a part of our fellowship, we were also trained in the mapping software called Maptitude. So I was able to help individuals in these communities draw maps for some of their cities and counties. Some individuals, they wanted to, present a map. So I was able to teach them about they didn't have access to Maptitude, but they did have access to something called Dave's redistricting. So I was able to walk them through that process, teach them how to create their map, as well as help individuals draw their own map as well. And so I know that there were, there were some challenges that Anneshia already spoke about, as far as not a lot of people not knowing. But I will say throughout that challenge, it really set me up and prepared me to educate in 2030. Even though a lot of people may not have been aware of this process this time, it did was really prepare me and pump me up to make sure that people are educated as much as possible by 2030. So thank you, Tish, for that question.
Go ahead, Ms. Pat.
Okay, now let's go to Tish. Tish, there are several redistricting litigations open in Alabama. You are co-counsel in the Milligan versus Merrill case, which is challenging Alabama's congressional district lines. Can you give us a synopsis of the various lawsuits that are open and provide insight into the key changes in the 2021 maps?
Absolutely. Thank you, Pat. Here in Alabama, we have 3 cases proceeding in the federal district court. The first case, Singleton versus Merrill, was filed by the literal grandfather of redistricting litigation in Alabama, Jim Blackshear, along with his litigation team, filed their lawsuit before the maps were even adopted by our state legislature. And Jim moved forward theory that the way that we have historically done the maps in Alabama is constitutionally suspect, in that rather than following county lines as the state constitution anticipates, we often and regularly split across counties and take into consideration matters that open the state to liability for potentially gerrymandering, inconsistent with the Constitution. And it's important to understand that Jim filed his case before the state legislature adopted their maps. He amended as soon as the state legislature adopted their maps. And soon after the adoption of the maps, the cause of action Castor versus Merrill was filed in federal court, followed by Milligan versus Merrill, which is the case for which I am co-counsel. Both Castor and Milligan put forth both a Title II of the VRA claim as well as a 14th Amendment claim. And really the distinction between and among the cases as to the 14th Amendment are about the legal theory underlying that analysis. Each of the cases has a different idea of how the implications of the 14th Amendment might work with redistricting in Alabama. I am most aware of and want to talk to you, though, about the Title II challenges that Castor and Merrill put forward, because those Title II challenges rely on the Voting Rights Act, which has been in place for a very long time and has been instructive in redistricting in Alabama through the 60s up to today. Now, Anneshia mentioned that this is the first cycle without pre-clearance. Pre-clearance was provided in the VRA in Section 5. It died last decade. And what we are seeing now is the result of the Supreme Court nullifying Section 5's pre-clearance process, which would have required that the state of Alabama submit their proposal to the government for review before those maps were adopted. When the Supreme Court eliminated the continuing need for Section 5, their idea was that the South had evolved and changed such that we no longer needed that pre-clearance. Of course, with litigation in South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, you get my point. But the maps in Alabama have always been problematic. Over 75 times, the state of Alabama has been cited for constitutionally suspect or inappropriate behavior in its redistricting process. And that is whether the party in control is Democrat or Republican. That is whether we are talking about the DOJ stepping in and having to litigate, or the DOJ deciding that certain things are less egregious than others. And please understand that what we are talking about here in many instances is drawing of district lines such that the impact of voters' preference is weakened by splitting them up into different districts so that those voting blocks cannot elect candidates of choice. Within the state of Alabama, irrespective of the party in charge, that means that Black voters are being prevented from selecting candidates of choice. In Huntsville, what that looks like is that for our maps, we see Huntsville split into 3. Instead of being retained as a whole jurisdiction when it comes to their preferred candidates. For the congressional maps, this comes into play as it relates to District 7. District 7, which is traditionally understood to be the minority district in the state of Alabama, has more county splits, it has more municipality splits, it has more community of interest splits than any other congressional district. And why is that so? One, that is so because our legislature draws the map such that they pack as many Black voters into the 7th district as they can. Why do they do that? When you pack into the 7th, you end up diluting the Black vote in the surrounding areas. And of course, District 7 nestles into that western side of Alabama and then cuts across central Alabama towards Montgomery. Our litigation highlighted those activities as being violative of Section 2. Castor similarly attacked the mapping process in Alabama, although their theory of the case would recommend different, slightly different lines than what the Milligan plaintiffs were looking for. Ultimately, all three pieces of litigation recognized that the state of Alabama was inappropriately moving forward in its process and procedure. It was taking into consideration qualifications and criteria that are inconsistent with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And the result is that candidates of choice for Black or minority voters are not winning in jurisdictions in which they may be the candidate of choice for the appropriately defined community of interest. Before our three-judge panel, when we were presenting these causes of concern, the court concluded that our claims as to Section 2, as it has traditionally been understood, were in fact credible, such that the state of Alabama should be compelled to redraw their maps following the recommendations of the Castor and Milligan plaintiffs. The court avoided considering our 14th Amendment claims because in the law, it is preferable that if you have a statutory basis for relief and a constitutional basis for relief, you should use the statutory basis first. And that's what our panel did. Our case was immediately appealable to the United States Supreme Court. And they should have been answering the question, have the parties demonstrated a likelihood of success on the merits such that they are currently entitled to the relief that they claim? The district court concluded that the answer to that was yes. The Supreme Court, instead of answering that question, decided to ask this question. Is the well-established jurisprudence of Title II of the VRA appropriate in light of our preference in statutory interpretation? And that's a very different question. That question does not evaluate whether everyone has followed the rules as they have been understood, but rather, should we change the rules? And is this the time to do so? And by doing that, the court kind of ducked and covered behind Purcell, which is a case that said, don't change election lines close to the election cycle. And in Purcell, the election cycle was in a few weeks, less than 5. At the time that the Supreme Court stepped in on our case, we were months away from even the primary. The court also seemed to suggest that despite litigation proceeding immediately upon the legislature adopting their maps, we still failed to hit the timing as they would prefer. And we are now looking at the potential to completely change the legal structure of how we deal with Section 2.
CJ, you want to ask the first question?
Yeah. So let's move into a cross-panel discussion, and I guess the first question will go to Tish again. So the New York Times just ran a story on Monday describing the Alabama challenge to one of 2 pivotal gerrymander cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. Many experts expect the justices to further weaken or even strike down a portion of the law dealing with racial disparities in redistricting. So what is the schedule for the SCOTUS review of Milligan v. Merrill case, and how would you describe what is at stake?
Milligan versus Merrill goes to the Supreme Court for oral argument in October of this year. Despite the fact that our case proceeded as expeditiously as possible, the court decided that they did not have the time or room on this year's docket to consider. So October, we will be before the United States Supreme Court. What we should be talking about is whether, under established law, Alabama did what they should. That's it. That's all we should be considering. But instead, I am of the opinion that we are in a fight for the continuing power and persuasiveness of Section 2 of the VRA. And I think that the court, based on its current composition, is prepared to eliminate Section 2 of the VRA. And that is a frightening thought for me as a legal scholar.
Yeah, the stakes are high. Thanks for that, Tish. I am going to pose this question to everyone. So how can the community in Alabama, and I guess elsewhere, stay in the fight? And how can voter turnout make a difference to racial gerrymandering? Anneshia, I don't know if you want to take that first.
Yeah, so I like the framing of that question. I think it's important that voters realize their power. There are several misconceptions, I hear in doing like pro-democracy work in Alabama. Common narratives are, it may range from, oh, it's, too red of a state, or why bother because of the supermajority, and the list goes on. But as Alabama voters, we have the power to go to the polls and fire and hire officials. I use that term fire and hire because I think it's important to understand that elected officials work for the people, not the other way around. And that voters ultimately, we have the power to change the course of our state and the lives of so many in our state by electing people to office. And I'm referring to both sides of the aisle, electing officials who will put forth policies reflective of the community needs, policies to build a better Alabama, one that's, inclusive, equitable, economically sound. During the public hearings, there was an older gentleman, and during his testimony, he made a comment along the lines of, he was speaking to the committee and he was saying, you can bury your head in the sand and, pretend like the issues that we're talking about aren't real. But there's a generation that is coming along like you've never seen before, and they're not going to stand for it. And that comment, it gave and still gives me hope in continuing this fight. And to, allow the organizations that are on the ground working to engage and raise awareness around, this process with voters. I just encourage, these organizations, to stay, in the fight, continue to put in the work to close the knowledge gap, around redistricting, and how important it is for us to have fair maps. During our last legislative session, we saw several bills being put forth that came, that just weren't addressing the issues of, the people. I think it's important for us to reframe redistricting as not this once in a decade issue, but now that I kind of play that back in my head, but as an issue that we should care about year round, right? An issue that is interwoven into, our advocacy work, our organizing work, and just how it's connected to so many core issues that we care about: healthcare, voting rights and representation, criminal justice reform, education, local issues. But most importantly, just finding ways, to spread the word and discuss this redistricting process, the litigation, not as a process or something like rules and laws, but ultimately making this synonymous with people, right? This is about people at the end of the day. And we have to communicate that this fight is about people, and voters have the power, at the polls.
We also need to keep in mind, I think, our last voting cycle, 2020, saw the highest voter turnout since the state recorded such things. And we were still below 50%. So this is not about changing the political spirit of the state of Alabama. This is about engaging and bringing in even a small percentage of the people who opt not to participate in the political process. We just finished our primaries a few weeks ago, and there were still some tallies that needed to be done. There was one election in which I believe the incumbent lost in the primary by 1 vote. And in fact, Secretary of State Merrill made the comment that when you hear people say that voting doesn't matter, this proves otherwise. 1 vote. And what I am most excited about as we turn to this next stage of this process is not the litigation. The litigation is sexy and interesting, and it's at the core of what I do. But Khadidah Stone, both as a Crowd Fellow and as a resident of the city of Montgomery and the county of Montgomery, pulled all of this stuff together and testified as a private citizen and an activist with a heightened understanding of what this process means. She went before the redistricting committee and told them about her own experience, her own concerns, her own desire for her community to be kept whole. Because the city of Montgomery has some very serious challenges. Our school district is losing teachers while other areas are adding to their roles. Even though we are one of the largest school districts in the state, we are just coming back to having localized control, and we still need more teachers, but we're losing them. Redistricting directly impacts that. The problems of policy for small jurisdictions should not overwhelm the concerns of larger jurisdictions, because the larger jurisdiction has a huge chunk taken out of it to provide population to a more rural area. These things matter. And for people living in these jurisdictions, your elected officials need your support, or they rely on your silence. And which one you are giving them instructs them as to whether or not they should continue or change. Your silence tells them to continue as they have been, whether or not it's in the best interest of your jurisdiction. Khadidah, how did you feel about your reception in that testimony, in that opportunity to testify? Because I think that having people directly connect to their representatives is invaluable, and it can be scary. What were your thoughts there?
I would say my thoughts were, given the history of how things have worked in the past, I went in optimistic, but I think once I received the response of them, kind of brushing it off, like, okay, with the questions that I asked about where, did they do a racial polarization study? They told me no, and all these things. It kind of it was very sad. That's how it made me feel. It made me feel, just disappointed. I felt like it was very. You could at least show that you care a little bit, but you showed me that you care none. So that's how I felt.
Do you think that's how people felt in the public hearings as well?
Yeah. Like Anneshia said, in some of those public hearings, they ended abruptly, like they weren't respectful of people's opinions. They were kind of like, okay. It kind of just gave the sense of like, we're going to draw how we want to draw it. We're just doing this to show y'all. We're just doing this because we have to do it legally. That's what it seemed like to me.
Yeah, and we have clips of some very heart felt testimonies during the public hearings, and to just see the committee just sit there and just disregard or answer, hey, your question's out of the scope, or I understand, or, you know, I mean, or sometimes the response was silence. You know, in Tish, you know, even doing the, you know, I think for me to see the emotional exchange between during the special sessions, you know, during the meetings, to see the emotional change between legislators. And I don't mean emotion as in passion, high, anger, but there were like some tear-jerking emotions saying, hey, let's just put party to the side. Let's just do what's right for the people. You know, at one point, I can remember legislators just saying, so you're just going to do what you want to do. You're just going to shove these maps down our throat. Like we're trying to speak up, you know, we're trying to speak up for these marginalized and disenfranchised communities that, you know, that you are that you're diluting their power.
One of the comments in the chat talks about the process and procedure of putting these maps together. I think the perception that people have is that our legislators sat down somewhere, got some training on what it is to do maps. They learned about what they needed to do. Then they did that. And then they had these maps and they looked at them and decided on which ones they wanted. And that's very simply just not the case. It seemed from watching, once the redistricting session started, there were some folks who were laying out the steps for the legal analysis of what should be done. Representative England literally laid out the legal analysis of what were the precursors to do this properly. It's almost as though he read the law. And the response that he got was shocking. First of all, even though he's on the committee, he didn't see the maps until the day he tweeted them to the general public. Yeah. That was his first time seeing the maps. Second, as he's asking questions and procedure of drawing the maps, which we thought that our legislature did, he basically said, I don't know, you'll have to ask our lawyers. They told us these were good maps. We're supporting our lawyers with these maps. The maps weren't drawn in Alabama. The contributors to the maps were not people in Alabama. The concerns did not highlight or underscore the social challenges of Alabama. It's quite a mess. And literally, the district court opinion granting the preliminary injunction mirrored Representative England's inquiries, despite the fact that that panel included 2 Trump appointees and that the entire judiciary in Alabama is relatively conservative. Even conservative jurists recognize the law as it is, required things that our legislature did not do.
Yeah.
Thank you all. I'm gonna go into the chat now and just offer some audience questions. We have a number of people in the audience who've been active in the Alabama case and in the VRA fight. Anna Catherine Berry of the NAACP Office of General Counsel and M. Christian ask, can you discuss how the John Lewis Voting Rights Act could fix the problem and whether the bill will be reintroduced? And Tish, I see you smiling there if you want to take it, or Anneshia.
I will just say that based on my fears and concerns about the VRA, the answer is a recommitment to voting rights, fairness, and holding states accountable for not discounting the value of their Black populations that may change their course. I am not optimistic about the outcome of the litigation. I definitely think that based on the current Supreme Court, there will be changes to how that analysis works, how revolutionary those changes are, depend upon how the jurists attach to the information. But we have seen some very drastic jurisprudential changes just in the last 6 months. And there's been no change in the population of the Supreme Court that would suggest that that's going to ease up. I'm interested in what Anneshia and Khadidah have been talking about and hearing from non-lawyers about the support for those pieces of federal legislation. It is critical that we reaffirm.
Hi, everyone. This is Anna Catherine Berry. Sorry, I'm off camera. I'm in the Office of the General Counsel at the National NAACP. And just thank you so much to this panel for providing such a great overview of what's going on in Alabama and in the redistricting cycle overall this year. I would just echo what Tish has said about the uphill battles that we've been facing in this litigation cycle. And in particular, the troubling nature of the federal judiciary. And it's not just the Supreme Court. You know, we've seen federal judges at all levels throw away, clearly established law and question whether individuals should even be able to sue under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, despite the fact that they've been doing so for more than 50 years. So just echoing that, and on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, we have legislative people who are more expert at this than me at the NAACP. I don't have a lot of hope right now, but I think it's extremely important that we don't give up on the legislative fight. And in particular, fighting for preclearance and other strong protections for voters moving forward. We need legislation. And so whether the John Lewis VRA is likely to happen, I'm not sure, but whether it does or not, we should make sure that we're continuing to push for legislation that protects voters. Thank you, everyone.
And I saw that there's a question as to whether or not the bill is dead. And nothing is dead until the end of the congressional session. And even if Congress goes out for their summer break without adopting or moving it, they have to come back before Election Day. And even after Election Day this year, they still have weeks of work to do before the next congressional session starts. And it's not likely, it's not popular, but there is pressure to bring to bear during this election cycle and during the lame duck session after this election cycle. In Alabama, the question is, are we prepared to pressure and push our delegation to commit to supporting and protecting voting rights, which they have historically supported, but are not supporting now for partisan purposes?
Thank you, Tish, for that. I'm gonna ask another question from the audience. Mike Altman of Tuscaloosa, Alabama, says that he was a part of a local coalition that worked for fair city council maps in Tuscaloosa. The council ended up passing racially gerrymandered maps. We have heard from some lawyers with civil rights groups that we have a good possible case to sue, but they seem to lack the staff, time, and resources to help. Perhaps also because it's a smaller local case. And he asks, what are the next steps that they can take to pursue legal action? And I know that I also just want to recognize that Anneshia has to hop off soon. So in case she leaves while Tish is answering, I just want to thank her very much for being here and lending her voice to this discussion.
Thank you for having me.
Go ahead, Tish.
I'm sorry, I was just caught up in the love. Repeat the question, please.
Yeah, so they're asking, Mike Altman of Tuscaloosa is asking what next steps can they take to pursue legal action?
Yeah, well, I am familiar with the situation moving forward in Tuscaloosa. I believe that there is also a situation that is moving forward in the city of Troy. And I believe there is also some movement in the city of Mobile. Local jurisdictions are required to meet the same expectations, both under the 14th Amendment and under the VRA. I would say for the folks in Tuscaloosa who are interested in litigating based on a belief that your local maps have been gerrymandered, first and foremost, make sure that you reach out to the typical litigation organizations that do this kind of work. That is ACLU of Alabama, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and of course, my friends over at LC, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law. And I'm sorry, that's a lot of information. And I usually do it as just the letters. All of those organizations have some type of structure in place to watch, listen, and take intake on these issues. All of them are also litigating as to the congressional maps and the state legislative maps. Everything is on fire. And so there may be a capacity challenge. That being said, if you do not put on these organizations' radar that you see a problem and that you are interested in pursuing that through litigation, then there's nothing more that can move forward. I am interested through the ACLU of Alabama in potentially working with law school clinics, law professors, or other people who have the capacity and expertise to do the work to put these cases together, to get them moving, both in the municipal setting and in the county setting. These issues matter. In the state of Alabama, over the course of the last decade, we have lost dozens of rural hospitals. We have food deserts in places where families and communities need groceries and access to healthy food sources. The county level and the city level are the closest to you. You are in the best position to recognize if some shenanigans are going on. Bring us into the fold. Let us figure out how we might be able to get some movement that's in the best interest of those communities.
Thank you, Tish. All right, before we hop off, I would just like to thank everyone for coming and maybe ask the panel, starting with Anneshia, because she's got to go soon, if they could leave us with a word, an idea, something to keep us going in this fight and in our support of you folks in Alabama. So Anneshia, why don't you go ahead?
Just wanted to say that we're all in this fight together. And when I say the fight, just realizing that when we talk about the fight for fair maps and the fight for fair representation, that this is bigger than maps. Like, this is about the future of our state. This is about, this is about people. This is about access to resources. As Tish mentioned, redistricting is connected to so many things that we all care about, issues that sit right at our front door. And we all have the ability to make an impact in this fight. And I just encourage everyone to tap in to, with the grassroots and civic organizations that are doing work in your community. If there are other states on the call, in your state. And I just, I thank everyone, in the state of Alabama and also our regional partners that have been a part of this collective fight.
Khadidah.
Yeah, I just want to echo what Anneshia said, to just make sure to be involved in your local communities and what you all have going on in redistricting. And thank you so much to Legal Women Voters for having me. I'm super grateful for this opportunity to speak about the issues that we had in this redistricting process in Alabama.
This is sexy, exciting, interesting stuff. I didn't mean to become a voting rights person, and here I am. If you are interested and engaged in this stuff, I need you to turn 3 other people into voting rights advocates and nerds. I need you to talk to them about it. I need you to encourage them to come with you to these things. I need you to push people to get excited about the sexiness of this stuff. And then I need you to give them the same instruction. We do not need to win hearts and minds of those already involved. We need to activate the people who are sitting on the sidelines because they think it doesn't matter. A small percentage of those people will change the trajectory of this work. And I'm really excited to be here at this moment in history to do that.
Amazing. Thank you, Tish. And I hope we all leave and follow those instructions, which are critical. Again, thank you everyone so much for coming. Thank you to the Charge Hub for helping make this happen. And we will be sending out a recording of the event so you can share it, and it'll also be on the Charge Hub website, hopefully soon. And with that, we will let everyone go. Thank you all for coming. Bye, everyone.